Before we jump into today's episode, I want to tell you about something new and something cool that we just made for you. I wrote it myself. Now, here's my assumption. If you are listening to this podcast, it probably means that you want to build long-term wealth with a rental real estate portfolio, and you would probably like to do it with some creative financing. And as I talk to people who want to do that, I know a lot of questions come up, and I thought there's really no great single resource that really captures the entire picture of how that works. But I have solved that problem because I have written a new PDF that is just for you, and it's called the Step-by-Step Guide to Buying Your First or Next Rental Property Without Relying on a Lender to Approve You for a Loan. Like I said, I wrote this thing myself, and if I do say so myself, it's pretty thorough. And in this, you're going to learn a few things. I'm going to teach you about the 3 key strategies to find and negotiate quality off-market real estate deals that nobody else even knows are for sale. I'm going to teach you about what I call the yeses framework for getting off-market sellers to accept your offers. And then I'm also going to teach you the 11 simple steps that you need to take to get your first or your next deal accepted without needing to go to a bank and apply for a loan and just hope that they give it to you. So if you would like to get this free downloadable PDF, just go to rentalwealthguide.com and you can download it right now. rentalwealthguide.com and get your download of the step-by-step guide to buying your first or next rental property without relying on a lender to approve you for a loan. Now, on with the show.
Successful real estate investing isn't all about we buy houses and motivated sellers. That's the lowbrow approach, and it gives real estate investing a slimy reputation. Gross. There is a better way, a more genuine, human approach. We are thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, and this is sleaze-free real estate investing.
This is Jeff from the Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneur. Welcome to episode number 17 of Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. This is a show for those of us who never felt at home in the We Buy Houses crowd. In this show, we take a stand against what we call the lowbrow approach, the mainstream guru seminar, distressed seller approach that ends up giving real estate investors a slimy reputation. Instead, we discuss the strategies, tactics, and philosophies that we call the thoughtful way, an enlightened approach to real estate entrepreneurship that focuses on constantly sharpening the sophisticated real estate entrepreneur's 3 most critical capabilities: seller relation skills, deal architecture skills, and opportunity vision. When all 3 of these capabilities are successfully in motion, you will make an excellent living today and build long-term wealth while creating value for everybody that you touch along the way. Show notes for today's episode are at www.thoughtfulre.com/E17. Please do yourself and do us a big favor by hitting your subscribe button in the podcast app if you haven't already. Also, if you haven't already, please rate and review the show in iTunes. It really helps other people who are like you looking for the right educational content to shine a light along the path in front of them. It helps them find us, and we appreciate it very much. In the last episode, we continued with a series that we're doing here about thoughtful approach to investment real estate properties that are rental properties specifically. So last episode, we talked about what we called the real thing that you're trying to create with your rental portfolio, and that is a concept I called leverageable equity. Leverageable equity is going to be absolutely key to today's topic. So if you haven't heard that episode 16, go back and listen to that now if you haven't already. Thank you. In today's main course, we're going to be continuing our discussion on rental properties, and we're going to be discussing the 2 different strategies for achieving financial freedom through cash flow. But first, as always, a little bit of food for thought. Because after all, we are thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, right? And we do like to think about things. We like to think about ideas and philosophies. And here is what we are thinking on today. Today's food for thought is about the dichotomy of options and your ability to see those options. So what do I mean by that? That sounds like kind of a conceptual type of idea? Well, as trees, we cultivate our ability to see things from multiple perspectives. It's actually usually one of our strengths, and that helps us see multiple options. It's actually related to and a part of the idea of empathy, which we discussed back in episode 14 in the Food for Thought section. It can mean seeing different or lots of different ways even to solve a problem. That's kind of one outcome of having this ability. It could be different ways to finance a deal, different ways to structure a deal. In my own case, in my own business right now, I have a commercial building that has one unit that I need to lease up. It's the biggest unit in the building, and it's a retail space. And I see multiple different strategies or approaches that I could use to get this thing leased up. There's the most straightforward way, which is just finding a single retail tenant to put in the space. I could actually divide the space up and have two tenants because the space physically is set up in a way that could work for that. Most recently, I was thinking about using the space for a co-working setup where you'd have not really retail, but offices, and people would share some common space, sort of like a WeWork model. We could do pop-up retail where you do use it for retail, but it's not the same tenant for the next several years. There's a lot of different options and angles, all of which I kind of like for different reasons. And another part of this thing is that I have the same building, actually, I need to refinance soon. And I'm also looking at and evaluating multiple different options for refinancing it. I could do a bank. I could go to a single private individual to refinance it. I could go to multiple private individuals to refinance it. Generally, I could use debt structure, loans, or I could use equity structure and bring in money through partners. And there's a lot of different ways. But at the same time, in order to move forward with anything, you often need to remove options. So it's fantastic that we can see a lot of different paths, but at some point we actually have to start checking those paths, crossing them out, so that we can continue to pursue the paths that make the most sense. The word decide, if you look at its Latin roots, decide literally means to cut off. The side, C-I-D-E, in decide is related to the word incision, for instance, to cut something. And to decide something would be to cut something off. And so you can't really pursue all the options for everything all the time, even though we in our brains as thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs have the ability to see a lot of different options. We can't really pursue them all at the same time. So what we need to do is be able to find a way to decide, to choose which options to remove and which doors to close. So this process is about having a strategy for choosing what not to pursue and a strategy for prioritizing the ways that you could go about it and choosing an order in which to pursue those ideas. This whole thing is easier said than done, and I'm not here actually to provide any amazing solutions or advice for you. I'm here to verbalize this funny dichotomy because this is the food for thought on my mind, and I know that you guys too will face this type of thing in your future if you are not facing it already, and I'm sure you are at some level, at some point in your life, whether it's in real estate, entrepreneurship, or just your regular everyday life. I think a lot about this one philosophically. It's like our superpower as thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs is an ability to see multiple options, but that superpower is also our kryptonite at times. A lot of swords have two edges, and I think this is one of those. If you have any insight or advice to share with me or with the rest of the listeners on that, I would love to hear from you. You can reach me via email at me@thoughtfulre.com. That is today's food for thought. Real estate investors get so caught up in which strategy to use, what the best way to do flipping or wholesaling is, or to make money with this or with that, or the shortcuts and the tips and the techniques. But we often forget that all deals have one thing in common, and that thing is that there's a human on the other end of the transaction, especially when you're doing business the thoughtful way and working directly with sellers. And if you could master the art of working with those people in a way that gets you to a yes that you need from them and gives you both a win, then it's going to transform your entire business. And that's why I've created a brand new webinar that I want to invite you to attend. It's called How to Earn an Incredible Living and Build Lasting Wealth in Real Estate by Mastering the Uncommon Art of Seller Relation Skills without working harder or doing more deals. What you'll learn in this free webinar presentation is primarily based on 3 secrets. Secret number 1 is how to easily uncover the hidden motivations of every seller. Secret number 2 is how to confidently meet face-to-face with a seller and come across as a trustworthy pro. And secret number 3 is how to market to sellers in a way that makes the phone ring and helps you buy properties that nobody else even knows are for sale. So come join us on this free webinar. To register, all you have to do is visit www.sellerrelationsmastery.com, sellerrelationsmastery.com, and we hope to see you on the webinar. All right, moving on to the main course of today's episode. And today's topic on thoughtful real estate entrepreneurship is the 2 different strategies for achieving financial freedom through cash flow. So just as we discussed in the food for thought section, we trees are really good at, and we like to see things from multiple perspectives. And that's actually what we're going to do today regarding cash flow and ways that we can achieve cash flow and use it. So let's step back for a second. Most people invest in real estate because they want financial freedom. That's not a surprise. That's probably what is on your mind and in your heart as well, and it is for me. What does financial freedom come from? Well, financial freedom comes from cash flow. It comes from money that comes into your world automatically each month without you trading your time and energy for it, right? It's making money while you sleep, as some might say. And when that cash flow coming in exceeds your living expenses, you are financially free, right? We learned that from reading Rich Dad, Poor Dad easily and quickly. When your cash flow coming in exceeds your living expenses, then you're financially free. And we all know, or else we wouldn't be creating and listening to this podcast, that real estate is a great vehicle for cash flow. And there are 2 ways to work towards this cash flow financial freedom. And neither of these ways is wrong. And I'm actually not here to tell you that you should pursue necessarily one way or the other way. But most people only think about really one way of doing it. And I want to show you today a second approach that I personally do choose to use a lot as well. And so the question is, why is this a thoughtful topic? Why isn't this just on any other podcast about real estate investing? Because as trees, we take the time to learn the many ways of doing things, the many ways of looking at things, to understand some of the concepts that are outside maybe the box that is defined by the normal real estate investing education. And then we choose deliberately which of the perspectives we want, right? So sometimes there's a lot of people who choose a path because they don't even really realize there are other paths available to them. We, as thoughtful real estate entrepreneurs, understand all of the options, and then we choose which path we want to take very, very deliberately. So let's jump into the 2 different paths. So we're first going to talk about the most common path, which is what I'd call incremental cash flow. In incremental cash flow, you sort of stack cash flow chunks up like building blocks, $200 or $500 at a time as you buy a property, until your cash flow meets your living expenses. This is like slow and steady, instant cash flow gratification. So if you buy a property today that has cash flow and it's generating $400 a month of cash flow, great. That's your first building block towards, let's say, maybe you need $5,000 a month or something like that to be financially independent. This is a $400 building block towards your $5,000 goal. So it's slow, steady, instant cash flow gratification. You build a little cash flow and then you harvest it for your own use. And so that's the incremental cash flow approach. The less common second approach, though, that I want to talk with you about today and compare and contrast for you is creating and harnessing leverageable equity. So again, if you didn't hear the last episode, please go back and listen to that first because it's really important prerequisite understanding and knowledge for this concept today. So in this second approach, you create and harness leverageable equity, and then you eventually convert your equity to cash flow. If the first option of incremental cash flow is instant cash flow gratification, the second way here, using leverageable equity, would be called delayed cash flow gratification. You build a little cash flow now, but you don't harvest it for your own purposes. Instead, you reinvest it for future growth. Okay, so the latter of these two options, the leverageable equity approach, is what I do. So let's dive into an example of each. And I want to dive in first to a relatable example of the incremental approach. So let's say that you save up $20,000 for a down payment to buy your first single family rental property. You buy it, you make some improvements, and now, because you've made some improvements, let's say you have $50,000 of equity and $300 a month of cash flow, right? So you basically bought $20,000 of your equity with your down payment, but through either your negotiation of getting a great deal or the improvements you've made, it now actually has $50,000 of equity. So you have created $30,000. Okay. And from that, you have $300 a month of cash flow. So you are feeling good about the equity that you have. And you're like, oh, this is nice to have this equity. Feels good. And you collect that $300 a month of cash flow and you use it to offset your living expenses. And you think, great, here's my first building block. And if I can replicate this over and over and over again, let's say, 15 times, I have the money that I need on a monthly basis. I've stacked up enough building blocks for my cash flow needs, and now I'm financially free. So you do it again as soon as you can. You save up again, maybe through your regular job or whatever your means of saving is, and you've got another $20,000 down payment. You buy another single family home. You make some more improvements. You've got another $50,000 of equity and another $300 of cash flow. And again, you take that cash flow, you collect it, and you use it in your life. And that's great. So now you have total between these two properties, $100,000 of equity in these two single family homes. You have $600 a month of cash flow, and you collect and use that $600 a month of cash flow to help cover your own living expenses. So you're getting closer to financial freedom. So let's say you do it again and you save up and you buy a third single family home in the same way. You save up your $20,000 down, you improve it, and you have $50,000 of equity and $300 of cash flow. So now you have a portfolio of 3 single family homes. You have $150,000 of total equity and $900 a month of total cash flow. And you collect that $900 a month of total cash flow and you use it for your living expenses. And you keep doing this as often as you can. And let's say that however you save your money, you're able to save up that $20,000 down payment once a year. So after 3 years, you have 3 houses. After 5 years, you have 5 houses. And you do this over and over again until you've bought enough properties that the building blocks of total cash flow number, that all the cash flow chunks add up to, meets or exceeds your own monthly expenses. And in the process, you've also built equity. Every year, you get a little bit closer to your financial freedom. You may choose at some point to sell one of these houses to sort of trade for a bigger house or a smaller apartment building or a duplex or something like that. And it's like trading in one building block to get a bigger building block. If you've ever actually played the cash flow game, the board game or the iPad version of the game by Rich Dad, the Rich Dad Company, which I'll put a link to this in the show notes. It is actually a fun game to play. If you've played that game, then this is the strategy that game allows you to practice. You have building blocks of cash flow investments, and you have an ever-changing and evolving sort of personal life and expenses that are reflected by that. And your goal in the game is to keep buying assets until the cash flow from those assets exceeds your living expenses. And that's what the game teaches you. And this is, of course, the most common way that people look at and think about building financial freedom by buying real estate. And then now, let's talk about the second approach, the leverageable equity approach. And let's give you an example of that. And then we'll compare and contrast the two just a little bit. So this example starts in just the same way. Let's say you save up $20,000 for a down payment. You buy your first single-family rental home, and you make some improvements to it. It now has $50,000 of equity because you negotiated below market price to a certain extent. You made some improvements. Your $20,000 down payment is now turned into $50,000 of equity, and you have $300 a month of cash flow. But instead of enjoying and harvesting the equity for yourself and collecting and using those cash flows yourself in your own life each month, what you decide to do is slightly different. You decide to reinvest this leverageable equity by, leveraging it. So using the principles of leverageable equity, you decide to put a $40,000 second loan on that property. Let's say that $40,000 second loan has got an interest payment of 6%, and you make interest-only monthly payments at 6% on that. So your payment each month is $200. So now what you have is you only have $10,000 of equity left in your single-family house, and you only have $100 a month of cash flow left, right? Because you borrowed $40 of the $50,000 of equity, and to do so, you used up $200 of the $300 a month of cash flow. But at the same time, you also have $40,000 of cash in your pocket, which is ready to use for another investment, another down payment, whenever you want to. So with that $40,000, what you decide to do is to buy another property. And this time you decide to buy a duplex because you've got a bigger down payment and you'd like to buy something with a little bit more scale. So you put your $40,000 down and you buy this duplex and you improve it. So just as you did the first time, you made some improvements, you negotiated a good price, maybe a little bit below what it was worth. And now your $40,000 down payment is actually $100,000 in equity. And you have $600 a month of cash flow. So again, now instead of enjoying and harvesting this equity and collecting and using this cash flow each month to offset your own living expenses, you decide to reinvest this leverageable equity again by, leveraging it. And so now on the second property that you own, you decide to use the principles of leverageable equity, and you choose to put an $80,000 second loan on the property. And again, this $80,000 loan is at 6%, and the payments each month are interest only. So your payment is $400 a month. So at this moment in time, your portfolio has two properties. You have a house and a duplex. You have $30,000 of total equity. That's $10,000 remaining in the first house and now $20,000 remaining in the second duplex. You have $300 a month of total cash flow. That's $100 from the first house and $200 from the second duplex. But you also now have $80,000 of liquid cash in your pocket. So what you decide to do is buy a third property. You decide to go bigger than the last one because, again, your down payment keeps getting bigger, and you decide to buy a fourplex. You put down the $80,000 as a down payment on your fourplex. You make some improvements, and now you have $120,000 of equity because you're a good negotiator, you're good at improvements, you've turned your $80,000 down payment into actually $120,000 of equity. And this fourplex has got $1,200 a month of cash flow. So now you have three properties, right? You have 7 total units, a single family house, a duplex, and a fourplex. You have in this portfolio of 3 properties, you have $150,000 of equity. That's $10,000 in the first one, $20,000 in the second one, and now $120,000 in the third one. You have $1,500 a month of cash flow. That's $100 from the first one, $200 from the duplex, and $1,200 from the fourplex. And there's no question in your mind. You just know exactly what you're going to do next, right? You're going to reinvest the cash flow and the equity again, and you're going to tap the leverageable equity again. But what a funny thing happens as you start to do this over and over again, you realize that really your total cash flow is always hovering just above zero. Because every time you build up some cash flow, then you borrow against the equity in that property and use up that cash flow that you just created. And you start to wonder to yourself, my goal is to be financially free, which means I need cash flow. But every time I go and create some cash flow, then I leverage it and I use it up. So how am I ever supposed to become financially free if I'm always reinvesting my cash flow instead of using it as building blocks to fund my own life? And as you ponder this question, and I know because I have pondered this question exactly myself, as you ponder it, you realize your portfolio and your equity is actually growing really quickly. In a year, you've bought a house, a duplex, and a fourplex. You bought 7 units, whereas it would have taken you 3 years in the other model just to buy 3 houses using the incremental cash flow model. And every time you buy a new property, which you are doing often, and you're doing on an increasingly larger scale, you make improvements that create additional equity for you. So while your total collective cash flow is not really growing because you keep intentionally using it up after you create it, your equity is growing. But wait a minute, now you can't retire off of equity, right? You need cash flow, not equity, if you want financial freedom. And that's when you realize that when you get to a critical mass of equity in your portfolio, you can actually convert that critical mass of equity into cash flow. So let's say you keep doing this over time, and at this point now you own 10 properties. And let's say you have 80% leverage, 80% loan to value globally across that 10 property portfolio. And so when you decide that it's time to convert your critical mass of equity to cash flow, you decide to sell 8 of those 10 leveraged properties. And the proceeds that come from those sales pay the remaining 2 properties that you didn't sell off. So now you own those 2 properties absolutely free and clear. And your cash flow now has gone up greatly because the 2 properties that you remain owning are absolutely totally free and clear. When I was first pondering this whole concept, and I was asking myself that question, right? Again, the question is, my goal is to be financially free, which means cash flow. But every time I go and create some cash flow, I then go and use it up and I leverage it. So how am I supposed to ever become financially free if I'm always reinvesting my cash flow instead of using it as building block to fund my life? As I was first pondering this, I decided I needed to explain this to myself, and I wanted to do it visually for some reason. So I created a brief video to explain it to myself and then to run it by my peers and my mentor and say, hey, am I understanding this correctly? So I'm going to put a link to that exact simple video in the show notes of today's episode. So I really encourage you to go over there and take a look at this simple video. It's very short, but it will visually explain what we're talking about using this leverageable equity methodology. So again, the show notes are at thoughtfulre.com/E17. So let's compare the 2 paths real quickly. In the incremental approach, you bought 1 property per year. You couldn't really go any faster than that because in order to buy a property, you had to save up a down payment. And every time you bought a property, you clearly got a little bit closer to your cash flow goal because you stacked a new block of building blocks of cash flow on top of whatever you had before, and you got a little bit closer to your cash flow goal. And after 3 years, you had 3 houses, which were like 3 building blocks stacked on top of each other of cash flow. In the leverageable equity approach, you bought 3 properties in 1 year, and they were increasingly bigger and more valuable each time. You were able to go faster as well because instead of working to save up the next down payment, you strategically leveraged the previous property that you had created equity in and cash flow in, and you extracted the value that you created in that previous property and used it as your down payment on the next one. So while your cash flow wasn't really growing because you kept reinvesting it, your portfolio and your equity was growing. So here's why this leverageable equity approach works so well. The way that you're really making money as you do this is by buying properties and adding value to each of those properties, right? You're doing this through physical improvements. You're doing it through managerial improvements like raising rents. So in our example, you were creating $30,000 of equity from each of these little houses that you bought. You'd put $20,000 in, you would do your magic value adding, and you would now have $50,000 of equity. So you created $30,000 of equity from each of those houses. So the more properties that you can do that to, or the bigger the properties you can do that to, or both, the more money you can make, right? This is the more chunks of $30,000 or more of equity that you can get. The leverageable equity strategy is an accelerant to this. It allows you to buy more and or bigger properties to do this with much faster because you don't have to wait to save up the next down payment. So in our example, right, instead of one $30,000 equity increase per year, you could do a $30,000, $60,000, and $120,000 equity increase all in 1 year, which created $210,000 in equity increases total just in that year. But I don't want you to get caught up with just the idea of speed and aggressiveness of growing a portfolio, because that's actually not the main message that I want you to take away from this leverageable equity approach to building a portfolio. The biggest point I want you to take away is the idea of delayed cash flow gratification. The idea of reinvesting the cash flow that you create and the equity that you create to buy more properties. And you keep doing that until you hit a critical mass of properties that you own in your portfolio. And then you restructure that equity and that cash flow by selling things and paying other things off. And then you begin enjoying all the cash flow that you have created. So to recap, neither of these two strategies is wrong or neither is right. It's just two slightly different ways, but importantly nuanced different ways to go about creating financial independence. But it's really important that you understand clearly both options, because both options and a mastery and understanding of both will allow you to thoughtfully choose which one you want to pursue. And that's what makes this a thoughtful topic. You need to understand all the options and deliberately select the one that best fits with your own goals and your own approach. I personally choose to use and pursue the creation of and the use of leverageable equity to grow and manage my own portfolio. So in closing, I thank you again for listening to yet another episode of Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. On the next episode, we're going to continue our conversation about rental properties, and we're going to be discussing the most amazing part of owning rental properties that, for some reason, nobody seems to talk about. Again, please do yourself and do us a big favor by hitting that subscribe button in your podcast app. Please go to iTunes and rate and review the show. And then that way, you'll help others like you find us. And by subscribing, you'll know exactly when the next episode is released. Reminder, today's show notes, including a transcript and including that video that I referenced, which I think is going to be important for you to see. The show notes are at www.thoughtfulre.com/E17. Until next time, this is Jeff from the Thoughtful Real Estate Entrepreneur signing off.
Thanks for listening to Sleaze-Free Real Estate Investing. Remember, solve the person to unlock the deal and solve the financing to unlock the profits.